First of all, thank you very much for not being led astray by the competing attractions. Many of you would rather be debating the Sewell Convention or perhaps attending to an association football game that I hear is going on and may well be being broadcast. But Lord Norton, thank you so much for standing in for the Speaker, for your amazing 100% track record of attending all of these lectures back to 2011. And thank you to the Speaker for asking me to talk in his lecture series on Brexit and beyond, Britain's place in the world in the 2020s. His generosity in opening up the Speaker's House to so many people is something that has been enormously welcome. Hundreds, if not thousands of people have had the benefit of seeing these splendid rooms, which was much less common under his predecessors. I'm a great admirer of Mr. Speaker for that, and also for the way in which he has consistently stood up for the House of Commons against the executive, and has been willing to take the brickbats that have sometimes come from the executive for doing that. So I'm very honoured to have been invited to speak, and grateful to the Speaker for his defence of our ancient rights. And it's even better to be discussing the future of Europe on today of all days, because it is, of course, Waterloo Day. If we go back to 1815, it was on this very day that the future of Europe was settled for 100 years. This was a period, at least from our point of view, from a British point of view, a period of remarkable stability and peacefulness. The Congress of Vienna had finished 9 days before Waterloo and had set out the way Europe was to be managed, assuming correctly that Napoleon could finally be defeated. And it was an important political occasion, the Congress, because it was the first time in which nation-states came together to work out how to live peacefully and to settle their arguments by Congress rather than by war. And this is how the modern world now works. We see it even with Donald Trump and Kim Jong-un. A Congress is a way of trying to bring two sides together. And it was important in recognizing that once a war had come to a conclusion, some settlement was needed. People had to compromise and trade off different interests, one against another. In addition, it transformed the United Kingdom's position in the world. After the Napoleonic Wars had finished, we no longer had to think, as we had done for the previous quarter century, about engagement on the continent. We were able to look more broadly to the rest of the world, and this is perhaps most important in terms of the Foreign Secretaryship of Canning. Canning recognized the states of Latin America and that they should have independence, and saw them as a balance to the powers of Europe, and not simply as prospective colonies for European states. Indeed, he backed their independence. And people often think of the 19th century as being, from our point of view, entirely about the British Empire, but it wasn't. It was more than that. There was a degree of understanding of an international and global approach, and the famous quotation from Canning is that I call the new world into existence to address the balance of the old. He said this in a speech in the House of Commons on the affairs of Portugal in December 1826. And Canning wanted to ensure that we could look away from the squabbles within Europe and further afield, and that there could be some balance in our relationships because we were not exclusively dealing with our nearest neighbours. And this proved to be very important to us in the ensuing century and indeed beyond. So there is good historic precedent for what we are trying to do and what we are beginning to do in terms of Brexit, looking away from the narrow European sphere and to the wider global sphere. However, there are three types of Brexit. There is, in the words of an advert that some of you may remember, I'm sticking to you because you're made out of glue. I think this was an advert for Hyundai. Actually, I'd completely forgotten, but one of my assistants kindly looked up that it was an advert for Hyundai in 2002. And this is a view quite commonly held amongst those who did not want to leave in the first place, that our best option is to stick like glue to the European Union. We may have decided that we're no longer legally obliged to follow the EU, but we'll follow it anyway. This is because we're used to doing so, and if we don't do what our neighbours do, it may damage us economically, especially if you believe in gravity models of trade. Then there's the gloomy, closed view, which is basically to say we've got to man the barricades, build walls, we need to close down immigration, we need protectionism for our economy, we need to create a sort of sepia-tinted 1950s version of the United Kingdom. And last, There's the view which I take and which I shall concentrate on in my comments, and that is that the UK should be open to the world, that our history is as a global nation. And if you think of the UK as the ship of state has been moored in harbour since 1973, but can once again take to the high seas, travelling the whole world rather than simply being in this small European port. And if you look briefly at these options in turn, you see what some of the problems are. The problem with sticking to the EU model and following it closely is that you then need to ask, what is the point of leaving? Admittedly, if we are within the EU, we may not have that much influence. It may not be very democratic. It may do things that we do not want to do. We may accept some unpleasant regulations, but at least we have some say in how they're created, and at least we have some votes in the Council of Ministers and some modest effect in the European Parliament. If we just accept what the EU does from the outside, we must surely be the vassal state. If you look at the list of our Norman and Plantagenet kings, there were numerous rows that they had over vassalage and bending the knee to their overlords. And I'm sure you all remember that King John agreed to do this to King Philip II of France at Le Goulet. And it was a great mistake for King John to agree to be the vassal of Philip II of France. It was an unhappy place to be. A vassal state is not a good state, nor is it a strong state. In truth, the vassal state is worse than membership of the European Union. And in this regard, Norway's example is interesting because the Norwegian people never wanted to join the EU, but Norwegian politicians have always been quite keen to join. So essentially, they have set up a system whereby they are members, but have not quite admitted it to their electorate, who consistently vote against joining if offered the chance. As it happens, most people, when offered the chance to vote against the EU, do vote against it, which is why the chance has been reduced in recent years. The second model, economic history tells you won't work, because protectionism harms those who put up the barriers. It's because you increase your own costs and you defend inefficient industries, and then find as time goes by that you need to make much more radical reforms than would have been necessary if you'd allowed the normal course of economic events to take place. I think if you look at the large-scale closures of businesses in the 1980s, particularly the early 1980s, that in part was because of the extent to which we had protected businesses in previous decades, and eventually their inefficiencies and lack of economic success caught up with them and indeed with us. And this led to a dramatic scaling back, which is much harder for communities and indeed the individuals affected by such changes to cope with. Going backwards will not work. There is no sepia-tinted 1950s vision. And I wanted to learn from the 19th century, not go back to the 1950s, if you see what I mean. We learn from our history rather than copying our history. And going back to the 1950s would not help the least well-off in society, and indeed it would make them worse off. Take closing doors to all immigration. That would be cutting off our nose to spite our face. What we want is high-skilled immigration that is beneficial to the economy. What we don't want is low-skilled immigration, and we don't want that for two reasons. One is that it stops productivity growth, because cheaper labour replaces innovation, and especially mechanisation. But it's also a type of migration which is most likely to depress the wages of those who have probably been failed by the education system and are least well off, have least advantage within our society. So we come to the point where, point 3, and this is the Canning-Peel-like opportunity. And as I said, there is much we can learn from our 19th century statesmen, that by opening to the world, we offer ourselves not just economic opportunity, but the chance to play a full role on the world stage in influencing how things will develop. Not on our own. I'm not suggesting that we have some neo-imperial vision or think we can become a superpower. We can't. But by cooperating with allies and friends beyond the European sphere. For within the EU, we are one of 28, and we are bound by the requirements of sincere cooperation to go along with what the other 27 agree. You see this in the current trade row with Donald Trump. We would be obliged to put up trade barriers on the United States, even if he said to us, look, the UK is a most friendly nation and our closest ally. we're not going to put any tariffs on the UK, we're just going to stick them on France. Sort of thing Donald Trump might be tempted to say. We would be obliged by EU law to put tariffs on US goods which the EU decided to penalise, even if we were excluded by the US. So once we're free of that, our opportunities are going to be much greater, and we'll be able to deal with other nations. And where do these benefits come from? The economic benefits, as you know, a great deal of work has been done by Patrick Minford and his team of economists on free trade. And they have calculated a post-Brexit dividend of £135 billion just between 2020 and 2025, with a further 40 billion a year from then on. And these benefits come from a mix of global free trade for Britain outside the single market and the customs union, plus opening up the British economy to the beneficial effects of entrepreneurial dynamism. Now, this is not a chance to quote George Bush Jr. and say that the French do not have the word for entrepreneur, as there is an obvious flaw in that argument, but that Europe is near the bottom of the class when it comes to the number of business startups tell you something important about the EU's attitude to enterprise. And the most obvious benefit from Brexit for individuals and their families will be our ability to leave the EU's prison of a protectionist customs union, which puts up barriers to global trade and keeps prices of non-EU products at an artificially high level. On average, 21% of people's income is spent on food, clothing, and footwear. Now, that figure will inevitably be higher for the least well-off in society, for obvious reasons. And the prices of these three areas are crucially important to all our standard of living. The customs union does not care about the least well-off because these three items are the highest tariff sectors within it, an average of 23% on food plus non-tariff barriers, which make some imports impossible, with 11.8% on clothing and 11.4% on footwear. Now, some of these tariffs, indeed most of these tariffs, are on things that we simply do not produce in this country. As a minor example, oranges are more expensive. But the trade barriers do not defend any UK interest. Even in the balmy climate of Somerset, we're not growing many oranges. And we are not defending our interest, but that of Spanish orange growers. Now, I wish Spanish orange growers every success and happiness. But I don't want the people of North East Somerset, in Radstock, in Midsummer Norton, and in Keynsham, to pay more for their oranges to benefit continental agriculture. This cost to individuals reduces their standard of living for no benefit for our domestic economy, and politicians should surely want to put their voters first. If we are to lift these tariffs, then suddenly and quickly there will be an improvement in the standard of living, most particularly of the least well-off. But it's actually better than that, because economically, if we open up to free trade, we will concentrate on those areas where we have a competitive advantage, and we will benefit from the lower cost of goods where others have a comparative advantage and sell to us. Even better than this, because it would be generous if we were opening up our own market, it is then likely that others would be more willing to open their markets to us. Now, some people don't believe this. Some people say, let's do it all through trade deals and negotiate and haggle around. But a little noticed comment by Donald Trump at the end of the G7 summit. He said, when everyone moaned at him about the tariffs, pointed out that Canadian tariffs on the US are higher than US tariffs on Canada, but never mind, Mr. Trudeau wasn't very interested in that. What he said at the end of the summit was, yes, I'm putting those tariffs on you, but I will offer you all complete free trade if you reciprocate. We should grab that opportunity because it could lead to such economic dynamism, and other countries, once they saw it succeeded, would want to follow. And this is already from the basis where it is expected that 90% of global growth is going to come from outside the EU in coming decades. So we're positioning ourselves correctly. It is not just theoretical. It is economic sense to open up the nation to anyone that will want to trade with us. Moreover, it will boost all our living standards, but especially those of the least well-off in society. In terms of the immigration system we work within the EU, under our current arrangements, we provide provide a 20% wage subsidy to unskilled EU migrants, or about £3,500 per worker per annum. Getting the level of unskilled EU migration under control means reducing it and could help see the living standards again of the least well-off, who I'm concentrating on very much because I think politicians have a special duty to them, by 15%. And this is achievable once we're outside the constraints of the single market. Giving a tax benefit to encourage people to come here to compete with those in our society who are least able to compete is one of the most ridiculous aspects of the rules of the single market. We should not offer benefits to people who have not worked in this country for several years. We want to have an immigration policy, and I'm very excited by what Sajid Javid has been saying recently and is moving towards, that welcomes high-skilled labour, so that we do not keep out doctors who we need, but we protect the most vulnerable in our society by reducing the admittance of the least skilled workers. This will have an economic benefit, but it may also have a social one, in that we will feel as one nation, one society, that we are supporting each other and putting the interests of our fellow Britons first. In addition to these advantages economically, there's some fascinating work done by the Economist Intelligence Unit on the economic advantage of ending the colonial effect. The unit produces long-term forecasts for developed and developing economies in its country forecasts reports. Its model looks at the main determinants of long-term growth, including quality of institutions, demography, human capital, trade, regulating the environment, and so on. The model includes a variable on independent statehood, and the colonial effect has been shown to suppress actual growth in GDP per head by about 1%. Lazar Kekik, who developed the model, has written that the colonial effect in the model is strong and extraordinarily robust on all specifications. It's remarkably persistent over time as well. And although the EU membership is not literally the same as being a colony, the factor does capture the importance of self-rule, or, to coin a phrase, taking back control. The long-term growth model suggests a maximum positive impact for these two, the other being the shake-up effect. So remove the colonial effect and the shake-up effect, growth sources of some 1.2% a year. If we apply just half of this, we would increase annual average growth to 2050 by 2.8% or 2.4% in per capita terms, a similar rate achieved by the UK economy during 1950 to 73 and 1995 to 2007. So it's a perfectly achievable level of growth that we could get back to. Now, economics is important, but it's not everything. And there are other advantages to leaving the European Union, sometimes ones that are less easy to measure, but nonetheless significant. I said at the beginning of the talk how much I admire the work the Speaker has done to put the House of Commons back at the centre of our national political life. This is important not only because as a member of the House of Commons I feel it's how it should be, but it's important because I think that democracy actually works. Governments need to be checked. The power of the executive must be held to account, and the ancient obligation on members of Parliament to seek redress of grievance is the highest importance. When decisions are made at the European level, the House of Commons simply cannot fulfil its role, as I discovered in trying to get redress of grievance for a constituent where it was an EU competence. Eventually, and it took a few letters, I got the message back from the government saying that if the penalty applied to my constituent were omitted, the British government itself would be fined. The issue, as it happens, concerned a dead cow and the reporting thereof. So the issue became one of bureaucratic inflexibility and the inability to put right a wrong. The restitution of our constitution is not as esoteric as it may seem. It is not necessary to accept the Whig interpretation of history, to see the advantages of our constitutional settlement and the benefits it has brought to us as the nation has evolved. A democracy underpinned by the common law and the rights of property, responsive to the needs of the electorate and of changing times, should be flexible enough to alter when necessary, but robust enough to stand up to the vicissitudes of political change. The British Constitution is, in my view, and Lord Norton, I hope you don't agree with anything else I've said, you'll agree with this, is in my view an object of great beauty, as is the American Constitution. Their flaws are in some ways mirror images of each other, but that's a slightly side point. Our Constitution is entirely democratic, but it has built-in protections against raw populism. The power of Parliament to make laws is theoretically unlimited, although nowadays it might be difficult to introduce a bill of attainder, but it is in fact constrained. I did at one point think of introducing one and had absolutely fascinating with the clerks about how it could be done in the most recent precedents. We were going back to the 17th and early 18th century, but let's leave that to one side. But it is in fact constrained both by the requirements of election and by the independence of the judiciary. We are currently discussing, or the House of Lords may just have finished discussing, the separation of powers. Although they are not as formalised in our Constitution as they are in the United States, they are nonetheless an essential part of it. Our Constitution has the ability to act quickly in changing circumstances and respond to the demand of the electorate, but the process of legislation and the bicameral nature of the legislature means that only the most ruthless Prime Minister with the largest majority can force through fundamental changes rapidly. Such a person is likely to have widespread support for what is being done anyway, as Tony Blair did in 1997. It is also through the constituency member of parliament system a powerful link to individual voters. I think our electoral system is as closely related to the individual voter as any election system in the world, who may still seek the historic right of redress of grievance. And this is something that has been going on since 1265. It is carried out weekly nowadays, up and down the country, as MPs hold Constituency Advice Bureau, where they undertake to act as champions for their constituents. As an aside, it's interesting to note that in the early 14th century, the development of legislation came from petitions, and the petitions came from individual members of Parliament who were seeking redress of grievance. It's basically the Constituency Bureau, Advice Bureau approach of the early 1300s. And it strikes me as remarkable to see how similarly we operate today. And the common law fits in with this as a human system based on precedent and historic understanding that could only be changed by specific statute. This provides both continuity and flexibility. It avoids arbitrary or bureaucratic rule. Now, the European Union is based on a different approach to government and a separate understanding of how the state ought to work. This is not necessarily better or worse. You can guess where my prejudice lies, but it's not necessarily better or worse, but it's always been hard to graft one onto the other. So restoring our constitutional order ought to lead to better government. Politicians will no longer be able to evade the blame if things go wrong by saying it was decided elsewhere. There are certainly stories of ministers having voted for regulations in Brussels and then come back to the United Kingdom to say how disgraceful these regulations are, and we will have to take responsibility for our actions. Equally, we will no longer be able to pretend that if it were not for a remote bureaucracy, we would not make mistakes. Dare I confess, we will still make mistakes even when we've left the European Union, because that is the lot of mankind. And therefore it's important that power and responsibility go hand in hand, and they will be reconnected once we've left the European Union. But leaving will also restore our global standing. Partly this is technical. We will once again take up our own seats on international bodies, where we have delegated our activities to the EU. In the World Trade Organization, instead of being 1/28th of a representative, we will have our own place, our own seat. This will inevitably give us more influence, because we will be there arguing our own corner, rather than leaving it to an EU representative to have to stand up for us. Removing ourselves, as I mentioned before, from the requirements of sincere cooperation will add to our global standing. This legal requirement of the EU has meant that even when we have maintained our own individual representation, we are bound to put our interests beneath the collective requirements of the EU. This will end once we leave and will allow us to be more forthright in defending our own interests and pursuing our own policy. And there's more that can be done than this. It's not just about the benefits of not doing things, it's the positive benefits of what we can do. So I've looked at the economic advantages and how, by taking back control, we can have an economic policy that is more suitable to our nation. And I've said how we can retake our seat on international bodies. But we have a choice as to what sort of nation we're going to be. Are we going to be in the EU social democratic mould, or are we going to belong to a world-beating nation that deals with the rest of the world on its own terms, not on the terms that we get set for us? And just look at what we've done recently with GDPR. It is onerous, bureaucratic, and restricts growth. There are many criticisms of data protection in the United States, but the United States is about to have the first trillion-dollar company. It has Amazon, Microsoft, Apple, Facebook, Twitter, on and on. It has these multi-billion-dollar companies that have succeeded because of a regulatory system that encourages growth. Now we can be part of that, not only part of it, but we can be a trendsetter within it if we try. Currently, we have fallen a long way behind. An article in today's Financial Times says that the Wikipedia ranking of unicorn startups by value offers a peek into the future. For Westerners, and for Westerners read particularly those in Europe, it should be disconcerting. Of the top 50 entries, 26 are from China, 16 are from America. There are, ought to be is, but never mind, none from Europe. The Chinese also dominate the proportion of the most valuable of these companies. Of the top 20 with an estimated market value of over 10 billion, 11 are Chinese, 6 are American, and 2 are Indian. Again, 0 for Europe. And that is really serious about how the EU is falling behind, and we've got to get away from that. In an area where we have advantage in financial services, the issue with financial services when we leave is not will business go to Frankfurt or Paris. That's the argument of the 1970s. The argument is now, will business go to New York, Singapore, Hong Kong, or even possibly Shanghai? And how can we deal with that? Why then wouldn't we start dealing more closely, and we already are dealing pretty closely, with the New York regulators, as with the US system, and set up a global regulatory framework for financial services based on the shared principles of the US and the UK, two common law systems that share basic principles, and would then become, once the two of us had set up such a system, the de facto regulatory system for the world, much better than setting up a bureaucratic system with the EU, a cooperative system with the United States, and we could get rid of the MiFID IIs, the AIFMDs, and the Solvency IIs that the EU cobbled together that are doing such damage to business and would have been fatal for the long-term interests of this city of London had we remained in the EU. But we are going to have to do the same on data. Rather than deciding that the EU standard is the standard that should affect the whole world, we should say we will talk to the Japanese and to the Americans and the Indians and the Chinese, and that we will agree a standard that is fit for business and will encourage enterprise and growth and help us be on that bandwagon that leads to trillion-dollar companies. In life sciences, my friend George Freeman, who was a Remainer but is now determined to make the best of it, wrote for Brexit Central, whose editor we have sitting in the second row this evening, last week, about life sciences, saying the growing hostility of the EU to biotech has had a hugely damaging effect on the EU bioscience economy over the last 5 years. Just as the genomic revolution has been started to offer untold opportunities across medicine and agriculture, the EU has been developing an increasingly hostile regulatory framework which has undermined Europe as a hub of biotechnology. It goes on to say, this regulatory hostility to biotech has had its most serious impact in agricultural research, where the EU's hostility to GM led German-based BASF to announce their withdrawal from Europe in agricultural research and development. That is a 10 billion euro disinvestment that Europe can ill afford. And this shows how the European system is holding us back in the life sciences. We need a regulatory system where we can be a leader and encourage activity in this area. Again, we should be cooperating with friendly nations, and they may not all be advanced economies, it may be emerging economies, it may be those that we need to talk to. India has the most remarkable pharmaceutical and medical industry, which actually in my investment career I invested in quite regularly. And those are the opportunities as we move into the reaches of the 21st century, the next generation, that the UK should be taking. So it's not about how you make the EU work a little bit better. It's about how, outside a failing superstructure, a structure devised in the 1950s dealing with the problems of the 1950s, we will deal with the problems of the 2050s. The issues that are going to arise then are going to be those of globalization. And so, like Canning, we have to be calling upon the new world to address the balance of the old. We need to be looking at those emerging markets that are growing so fast. We need to look at the forms of regulation that will make our industry effective. But most of all, we need to have confidence in ourselves, in our constitution, belief in our democracy, and pride in our system of government, because it has the flexibility to deliver what the British people want and to give them that sense of hope and determination and courage that we can do it for ourselves. I've always thought that by and large, individuals making decisions for themselves make better decisions than others can do for them. This applies on the national scale too. The nation state can make better decisions for itself than other nations can impose upon it. I believe it for the United Kingdom, and I believe it for other nations around the world. This is the opportunity for the UK in 2020 and beyond. It is to have confidence in ourselves, to make the alliances that will lead to success, and ensure that we have the right economic policies in place. And it is to look at the broad global outlook and stop ourselves having the narrow, myopic focus of Fortress Europe. Thank you.